'cause you can't, you won't, and you don't stop. Or when you can't, you won't, and you don't stop.
So the final element of owing a duty is negligent misstatement. So negligent misstatement is different in that there's no act or omission. It's about what happens when you give advice that's being given carelessly. When you're responsible to other people for the economic loss that follows from careless advice. So the first step that we have to do there is establish that the person giving the advice owes a duty. And we have two particular tests here. One test is based upon the idea where it's direct advice. So I give advice to you. That's probably the more typical situation. The second situation that we're going to deal with is where someone develops or provides some advice, and that advice is then used by someone else to the end person. So this is kind of similar to the situation of a manufacturer who makes a product, who sells it to a retailer, who sells it to the consumer, right? When is the manufacturer liable to the consumer? It's the same kind of thing, but with advice. So we have a bit of a different test for that. So let's hop into negligent misstatement. Negligent misstatement is where someone provides advice or information that's inaccurate or misleading. Now, it's not about dishonesty, right? Because that might be something like fraud would cover that criminally, and also we would deal with fraudulent misstatement. Instead, it's honest advice, but careless advice. And it's particularly important for the professions: accountants, auditors, marketing, advisors, consultants, etc. So it covers a range of professional services that we would have these days. First thing to note is the test for direct advice. Now, I really want you to note about this test. It's not that you must actually provide the advice in business, right? That's not the test. Okay, so you can be owe a duty of care giving advice even when that advice is not given like within business. Generally it will be, but not necessarily. So what is the actual test? Well, there are three elements. The first element is that the advice must be of a serious or business nature. The second element is that the defendant, or the person giving the advice, knew or reasonably should have known that the other person was going to rely on the advice. And then finally, that it was reasonable for the plaintiff to actually rely on the advice. You have to meet all three elements, but if they're met, then you owe a duty of care when you're giving the advice. Okay, so that means just say you do a marketing degree and you understand marketing a bit. Well, hopefully more than a bit with a degree, but you understand marketing, and a friend comes to you and they talk about marketing in their business. Do you owe them a duty of care? Okay, well, is the advice of a business or serious nature? If it's about marketing, yeah, it's business advice you're giving them. Did you or should you have known that the person was going to rely on it? Well, they've come to you about marketing knowing you have a marketing degree, and if they're kind of serious in their conversation about using what you tell them, you really should know. Okay, so even if a friend comes to you, right? Notice we're not in business here. The third element, is it reasonable for them to rely on it? Now, again, that's going to be very contextual. Friday night at the pub, just having a couple of beers, shooting the breeze, less likely that they could reasonably rely on it. They've come out specially to your office to have a conversation about it. That sounds like they could reasonably rely on it. So again, context matters, right? But you have to have all three elements to owe a duty of care for the advice that you give. So the second test is a bit more of a different situation. And I know that a lot of people might not have run across this yet, but as soon as you enter financial services, for instance, this is the kind of model that often gets used traditionally in financial services. You have a big company that provides insurance or investment products. Say it could be a unit trust that you invest in or an insurance product. And there might be a company that provides that. Let's call it Company A. So Company A develops these products and it's big, has a lot of access to capital. And what it does is it gives a commission to agents who sell those, right, who advise clients so that if a client uses this insurance policy or invests in this trust, then the company that developed that that product will give a commission, or they may even just pay the agent who's selling that to the end consumer. So when they're developing these products, like an investment product or insurance, they come up with information and advice about what you should do. And then the agent uses that when they talk to you. See how they're kind of manufacturing? Right? It's like a manufacturer-retailer kind of situation. And so the issue is you get your advice from the agent, but that advice was prepared, right, by the company providing the product. So when is the company providing that product liable for the information and advice that they develop if they do so carelessly? When do they owe a duty of care? So I really want to stress that this issue is, where there's an end user who's the plaintiff and there's a developer of the information who's separated by some form of agent or on-user or seller of the advice. When is this person, the originator of the advice, liable to a person? And remember, there's no contract now about this advice between the defendant and the plaintiff, so they can't use contract to solve the problem. Just as with a manufacturer in Donahue and Stevenson, the person who drank the ginger beer couldn't establish a contract with the manufacturer because they bought it from a retailer. This is the same problem this test is overcoming, only it's about advice and information. Okay? So a person giving advice will owe a duty to a third party if they give their client business or serious advice, knowing that the client or the agent or on-seller of the advice will communicate that advice to the third party who's going to be our plaintiff. That advice is likely to lead the third party to enter a particular type of transaction. And it's likely the third party will suffer loss if they enter into the transaction and the advice is wrong. Okay. So what we're having here is someone who's preparing advice for a specific person, kind of their client, to on-sell, to communicate, or to at least inform, if not on-sell, to communicate to a third party. And that advice is to enter a particular kind of transaction, like an insurance product or an investment product. And if the advice is wrong, then it's going to end. So we satisfy those three elements. Then, in this case, the developer of the idea or the person who originated the idea owes a duty of care to the third party, okay, who will become the plaintiff if that advice is wrong. So there we have it, owing a duty of care under negligent misstatement. We have the test for if it's direct advice, and we have the test for if it's indirect advice. So all up, remember that there are 4 ways that we can owe a duty of care. 2 under negligent misstatement, and 2 for a general act or omission. For a general act or omission, it's going to either be an established category, so there's already been a case that establishes this kind of person owes this kind of person a duty of care, or we're going to use the test of reasonable foreseeability and salient features of the case. Okay. If it's negligent misstatement, then we need to think, is it direct advice? And we use the direct advice test, or is it indirect advice? And we use that second test for negligent misstatement there. It's a lot of stuff to think about, particularly that issue of reasonable foreseeability in terms of owing a duty of care. In the next module, we look at the other 2 elements of negligence, whether you've breached that duty of care and whether the breach causes the harm, along with an overview of the defences that are actually available. That's for the next module.